When Lee was hired at what's called the Texas State Book Depository now, he didn't call it that back then. It was a different name. I can't remember it anymore. But when he was hired there, that thing was all set up. And Mr. Truly, who was there, thought Lee was working for the FBI. He didn't realize that he might be working for someone else, or it might be some other connection. That whole thing was set up ahead of time. Lee even knew, had boarding nearby and everything. I mean, that's just the way it was. In fact, Mr. Truly let him leave the building from time to time. It was sort of like Riley's was. He could, even though he worked on one floor most of the time, he was supposed to sometimes be on other floors. Hey, he'd be gone part of that time, and people wouldn't even know it. Meanwhile, Lee was telling me, as we had our various phone calls, which were usually at night during the weekdays, and we would talk for an hour and a half. People say, well, how could he do that? He went right out the window. That's how he did it at this one boarding house, at least, because he told me so. It's just like going out of the window at my place. He was very adept at that. But when Lee was talking to me about some of the concerns he had, one of his concerns is that his newborn baby and his little girl, that his children would wonder, he saw that with the way things were transpiring, that he might be included in the list of those who were trying to kill the president. He also suspected he might even be made a patsy. Now, these were suspicions he had and concerns. So he made some efforts to be a contact or an informant for the FBI, and he did some other things to try and prove that he was a good guy. I don't know many details about these things, but I also know that he made threats, either mailed them or phoned them or something, death threats on the president as we get closer and closer to the time that Kennedy is coming to Dallas. Lee actually took the risk of getting found out himself as someone who was threatening the life of the president in order to try and up the security on Kennedy. A very brave thing that he did. The Lee Oswald I knew is such a different man from the frail and ugly little creep that they tried to make him out to be, who was so-called patsy. He knew exactly what was going to happen to him. Even though he was made a patsy, he risked his life to try to save the president. In these last two phone calls, for example, various names were brought up, and I remember one as Roselli. I remembered it because it had Lee's name in it. There were other things that Lee told me, that I shouldn't feel sorry for him, as I said before, and that he also wondered what would happen to me. I told him I was going to be trapped with Robert unless he could get me out of that situation, and he said, here are some of the things we're going to try to do to get me out of this. He said, I don't want to die. Anyway, some of the things he brought up was like that. He said he had a friend who had been a policeman for some years, and he'd even known before he went into the Marines, and he'd confided some of his problems with him, and that this man was going to get a police uniform for him to wear, and that maybe they'd be able to get onto a plane. I think he mentioned Redbird Airport, but that they would be able to get on a plane together like they're inspecting it, but only one of them would get off the plane. And then where that plane came down, which would be in Houston, that a policeman would get off the plane, at that time, and it'd be a small airport. Nobody would care or notice because it was a policeman, or so it would look like. He mentioned several other ideas that he had as well. Now, Lee had a way of really assuring you and making you feel like things weren't all that bad. And he wasn't a complainer. So I kept trying to imagine that somehow we'd make it together. And so we talked about Quintana Roo and a place near this village, Concu, where the Mayan ruins had been discovered. And it was all in the papers and everything in 1963 about the Mayan ruins and how wonderful they were. And this was on a route that could get you to a town or a city called Merida. And Lee said he could be flown from Laredo to Merida, and I could meet him in Merida. And, we could see the ruins if we wanted. If he got out of it alive, I expected to meet him in Merida. And that was important to me, and it gave me something to hold on to. The last phone call I received from Lee was Wednesday, November 20th, late that night. It was in response to a telephone call I made because Lee had talked to me Sunday, but he was supposed to talk to me also on Tuesday and then late this night. And he had not reached me or contacted me after Sunday. And I knew we were running out of time, and I wanted to know that he was all right. So it's only supposed to have been done for emergencies, but I called him. Today it's called the Texas State Book Depository, but I made a call, and that linked to another call, and then I reached the operator in Covington, and she put me through to the Texas State Book Depository. At that time, I said, I'm trying to locate to see if you have a Lee Oswald there. I did not say Lee Harvey Oswald, even though later that seems to have been injected into this conversation. And I said, he is the new janitor. Now, I had used J.A., and those are the first two letters there, the J.A. and janitor, so that Lee would know it was me who was calling him. And the hour I called told him when he could call me. That's the way we had our phone thing set up. So I said, is he there? And she said, wait, I'll see. She said, yes, he's here, there. Then I said, fine, goodbye, and I hung up. This call got recorded by someone and is on record. The person had no accent, woman, and so on. Well, Lee, and so he called me back that night. Of course, he knew when to call, and so I was there because that's the way this thing is set up. And at that time, it was about 10:30 at night his time, or maybe 11. And for me, it's an hour later. I had actually to leave my house and go across the street to a payphone to get this call. But no problem. Robert wasn't there. Robert was never there, it seemed, when I really needed him. He was at the library at the University of Florida working on things for midterm exams. And that would be the case all through the late November before we would have our Thanksgiving break. I'm standing here on this cool November night listening to Lee talking to me, and I know it's the last time I'm going to see him before the assassination, is hear his voice. And he and I are not doing very well. We talked for about an hour and a half. There's a record of a janitor who saw Lee at this laundromat across the street from his boarding house at about 11:30 at night his time. And of course, Lee did his laundry at Ruth Payne's. I could hear cars going by, and I knew he was in a place where at least a door was open or it was open to the air in some way. And during this time, I'm saying, Lee, isn't there some way you can get out of this? Because he made it clear to me that the people who he was involved in, they were never the same one day to the next. And he tried to make contacts with Hosty and others who, I don't know whether it's Hosty, but I know he was making contacts with the FBI, and he tried to get across some of his concerns in a way that would not involve other people. And they were ignoring this, and he believed it was on purpose. He also was involved with the FBI in some kind of information that he was giving them about some kind of gun or drug running. And he was doing all of this because he didn't want to have on his record that he was one among those who were trying to kill the president, and maybe that would come down to his children. He was very concerned about that. He also told me he didn't think he'd make it out alive. He was sure he'd be shot the day of the assassination. Left behind, his body left behind, and stuff planted there to prove that he was the one who killed Kennedy, if it went that far. He said that. He didn't know even. And we're talking about this is going to be Friday. Now, understand that when I was talking to him, it's the end of Wednesday, and we're coming into Thursday. We're talking about like 37 or 38 hours before the assassination is the last time I'm talking to my Lee Oswald. And there is not going to be another time I'm ever going to hear his voice or speak to him or hear him again if he doesn't make it out alive. And he told me not to be concerned about him, and he was going to be all right. That if he possibly could make it, he would. That he had people that were there with him. He said he was going to be here on this part of the route, and that someone would be over at the Trade Mart who was working with him. He wasn't alone. He stressed that he wasn't alone. He also said that he would have a chance, he might even have a chance to leave that area at noon or so. They would call him and tell him whether he had to stay at that place. He didn't call it the book depository, he called it some other thing, that place, where he was working. He'd either have to stay there or he'd have to leave to another location because it was lunchtime and they could move him somewhere else. At this particular time, he or David Ferry later, one of them, either he told me or David told me later, that he was part of an abort team, a team that was trying to stop the assassination. I asked Lee if there's some way he could get out of this at the last minute. I mean, if he couldn't stop the assassination, why couldn't he take a bunch, I really said this because of my medical training, take a bunch of laxatives or something so he could really get sick and not be able to show up. And at that time he told me, if I stay, there will be one less bullet aimed at Kennedy. And I never forgot that. He told me not to feel sorry for him. He had a chance to save the president. He still would take that chance. If there's anything he could do to save the president. He even thought he might be able to have a chance to fire a warning shot to alert the Secret Service. These were some of the things he told me he would try to do. Lee told me the attempt to kill Kennedy would be either at the airport when he got off deplaned, except that he said there was so much exposure there it might not work, or it was going to be at Dealey Plaza, or it was going to be at the Trade Mart. Those three areas, locales. And he believed it would be at Dealey Plaza because of the setup and the location of everything. It was just perfect in his consideration. And he knew enough about guns. I'd been out with him. He understood that there was a triangulation possibility there and so on. Lee was a much better shot than people think he was. When he was in the Marines, the first time he shot was so good, they told him, don't shoot that well anymore. Okay? Because even then he was being thought of as someone they could penetrate with into Russia or take to Cuba or so on. And they didn't want to make him look like he was highly trained. But he was a good shot. He was a better shot than has been thought. Lee also told me that Kennedy's driver was known and his habits were known, and that they knew that he would not be in the habit of responding quickly and driving quickly off if shots were fired. So Lee had some inside information that was pretty specific and convinced me, of course, that he was exactly who he said he was and what he was doing. Lee told me that Onassis knew that this was going to happen, not that he was involved, but that if anybody hurt Jackie Kennedy, that he would make sure that they died a slow and torturous death. And that was of concern to these people. I was supposed to wait, and if I got a call from David Ferry, he told me when Dave would call me. If I got a call from him, I could go over to Eglin Air Force Base. Dave had already given me a book that had a person's name in it and was stamped Eglin Air Force Base. I still have the book. And if I showed that at the gate, I could get in, and I'd have a plane ride over to Mexico. But I had to wait for Dave's call and hold cool. And this was not going to be easy for me to do, I'll tell you that. At any rate, I guess they had to keep me calm and make sure that I would not blow it and show emotion if I heard that the president got shot. Of course, if the president didn't get shot, we'd all have rejoicing. And I'd definitely get to Mexico. So you can imagine how I felt on the morning of November 22nd. The last thing that Lee told me, the last few things he told me were very important to me. I mean, this goes beyond saying that we loved each other and that when we used to walk together, Lee wore his wedding ring originally on his left hand, and I wore my wedding band on his right hand, and I wore my wedding band on my left hand, and as we walked, our rings would click together, and it made me very self-conscious. First, that I had to buy my own wedding band, and that Lee was wearing the band that meant he was married to Marina. And he told me that when he came, he wouldn't be wearing any wedding band, and I better not be wearing mine. They were going to get a new set of wedding bands for us in Mexico. I just wanted to mention it this time because that's when he mentioned it in one of the last few things he said to me. He said if he didn't get out alive, I said, I just didn't know what was going to become of me. He said, I want you to have babies. And that stuck in my heart. I ended up having 5 children. There are other things that sound silly now, I suppose, but he used to call me Minnie Mouse because of all the mice and everything. And I had a mouse pin collection, and I'd given him a mouse pin and things like that. And just before the last time I saw him, when we pulled out, I'm going back in time, but because we talked about it at that time, the last time we saw each other was September 1st when Robert pulled out and I'm sitting in the car, and we turned around the corner on Magazine Street, and he's standing there at the street corner reading a newspaper, 7 o'clock in the morning, and I could almost touch him as we look at each other, and I never saw him again, of course, you know. But we talked about how we had seen each other for the last time, and that he hoped that I would never give up and just hold tight, you know, till I'd see him again. He told me never to forget the names of 3 people. One was Billy Solestes, and the other was Bobby Baker. I couldn't forget that because of Bob Baker I was married to. And then he mentioned again David Atlee Phillips. While he didn't have confirmation totally that Phillips was his handler, he suspected it by now because of these photographs from from Cuba that he had viewed, and he had found out that Phillips lived in Fort Worth, and these photographs had come from Fort Worth. And a new facility, by the way, in Fort Worth that had processed them. All these things were on Lee's mind, and he didn't want me to forget that. And that's about all I can tell you about our last conversation, except personal things. I knew Dave was going to call, and it rang, and I answered. And on the other end, I hear panic-stricken David Ferry like I've never heard before. And he's even crying and weeping, and everything had gone wrong. Everything that possibly could have gone wrong had gone wrong. And he was aware of what had happened to Lee. He said that they were going to get mob lawyers to get him out. They could spring him. He hadn't yet been, there was hope because he hadn't been actually blamed for the death of the president or anything by then. He said that Lee, so far, even though he'd been mistreated and beaten up and everything like that, and they deliberately beat him up, he said that Lee was alive. And that was the best news. He should, because none of us thought he'd survive if this thing came to pass the way we thought. And then there was hope. And he said, as long as there's hope, he said, I swear to you, by God, I'm going to go, I will get to Houston, and we're going to, if that plane comes through and he's able to get on that plane, he said, I'm going to be there and I'm going to pick him up and fly to Mexico, into Laredo. And he told me that he was going to be going to Houston. But the biggest thing on his mind, before he said all of this even, almost before he told me about Lee, was he wanted to know where the library card was. And this thing is extremely important. I had a medical library card to get into the medical hospitals and the libraries and the university libraries. And this was an auctioneer card that had been given to me, but I got it through David Ferry. Actually, it was David's number. Dave could go into any of the medical libraries there and pick out books and so on. And he'd been running this project for about a year before that. He'd handed the card to me because they knew him and they didn't need it anymore. And so when I went in there, I could show the card because I didn't have any student ID. They could show this medical library card, and I could get in, and they could give me books from the stacks to check out against Ochsner's name. Well, obviously, this card could be easily traced. What happened is Jack, the person we'd had so much trouble with, was still angry at Dave Ferry for a number of reasons. And he had actually learned from David Lewis that Dave Ferry had given his medical library card to Lee, which was true, because Lee gave it to me. And I had that card, and I had used it, but after a while, the people knew me there, and I didn't have to pull it out anymore. And when I left, and I was so upset about leaving Gainesville, to go to Gainesville from New Orleans, I forgot to give the card back to Lee. However, Jack Martin thought, sure, when I left town, I would have given the card back to Lee. So he calls these people and says, there's a library card out there that Lee Oswald's been found with or has. Look for it because it belongs to David W. Ferry. And Jack Martin had been really burned with David Ferry because of lately he had been picked up, and there was some kind of thing going. There was a homosexual thing going on top of everything else. Well, what happened is, and now they're conflicting stories I've heard, but here's what David told me. He said he actually even went to Lee's apartment, then he went to the apartment owner, who was down the street, and other places looking for the card. He even went to the library, the public library, because somebody said that, well, they'd seen Lee there or something. He thought, well, maybe the card accidentally, I don't know. He told me all kinds of things he'd done. And then he asked me, he said, I've done all this. And then he said, I'm going to have to ask you this. He said, did you keep the card? Oh boy, yeah, I had the card. I had the darn card. He said, get it out. I got it on my purse. I felt like an idiot. He said, I want you to tear it in little pieces and burn it. And I'm standing here by this liquid oxygen tanks and everything, so I didn't burn it, but I told him I did. I'm tearing it up. He said, tear it up. I'm tearing it up. He said, bury it. He said, burn it. But I buried it in the sand there under the trees. I told him I burned it because I didn't want it. I told him I was going to burn it or something. Anyway, I satisfied him. And it was a horrible, stressful time. And then he told me that he, all the other things about Lee, and that he was going to go to Houston. And in fact, he told me about Hull Airport. The reason being, if something went wrong, I would know the details. I might be able to connect some other place or whatever. He was going to go over to this small airport in Alief, Texas. It's not, you go down Westheimer Road from Houston, and he would there have a plane waiting. That plane was be where Lee was supposed to land if he made it through without any trouble. He was going to pick him up, take him over to Hull Field. This is today's Sugarland Airport. It's not just but a few miles away. Another small airport. The man running that was an FBI agent. His name was Don Hall. His family has to know he was FBI, and but you won't find records. It just says he owns the airport and all that, but definitely FBI. The plane that was there, that was supposed to be there, was supplied by somebody from Schlumberger. And this was through the wife of a Schlumberger employee, somebody high up. And she was associated with Rice University. These are things that David Ferry told me. So it reassured me, okay, about the trouble they'd gone to try and get Lee out alive. And he said if he made it, of course, and all that, that's what would happen. And then he described all this plane and everything to me because I was supposed to meet that plane, okay? That plane would be used again to get me over to Merida, Mexico, because the other plane was supposed to fly me to a really weird place, and there's nothing there. It's near Belize, near what's today is Cancun and all that. I would be dumped there, but this plane was supposed to come and get me and fly me to Merida if it made it through, and all this kind of thing. Of course, I'm waiting to find out if Lee gets out and all this can happen. And it's really awful after what happens after that, because of course I watched Lee get killed on television. Robert again was at the library. I went next door to Ron Ziegler's home where they had a TV set, and I was there trying to eat lunch and everything, and Lee was brought out and shot down like a dog. And I don't hardly remember anything else that whole day. But David Ferry did call me after that, and he, of course he was sorry. He told me that I had to stick it out, that I couldn't open my mouth anymore. I had to keep my head down, and Santos Traficante was a good friend of Carlos Marcello, was watching me, that they weren't going to hurt me if I was quiet, because I couldn't even fight my way out of a paper bag. And that they felt I was harmless if I just shut up. I've shut up all these years. When Lee left to go to the Texas State Book Depository that morning, the morning of November 22nd, he left behind about $160 or $170. And this is so that Marina would be taken care of, but it also made a statement about me and him. I knew he wouldn't come to me with that ring on, but he did wear a very significant ring that day, and that was his Marine ring. From the very beginning and to the very end, Lee was a Marine, a good Marine. For so many years, I couldn't speak out. Who would believe that a 20-year-old girl had been involved in things like this? Who would have believed that the CIA and the mafia were working together on ways to try and kill Castro? How could I have spoken up when I had child after child? I had 5 children, and I had no way to prove any of this as far as I knew until a lot of records recently have come out. I'm doing this because I'm angry. I'm angry at the fact that after all these years, people are still saying, not even the alleged assassin, sometimes Harvey Oswald was the assassin. This is a man who was a brave man who gave his life for his country, who has been maligned and his character assassinated, a man who's been blamed for the death of our great President Kennedy, who loved President Kennedy just as much as I did. And I know some of those people out there who are responsible are still alive. I really want revenge, and that's why I'm doing this. And I want people to know who Lee Harvey Oswald was. I was just a young girl. There's so much I didn't understand, but I know now. And I don't care anymore what happens to me. I want to tell you right now. I just want the truth to get out. I was only 20 years old at the time, a young girl who had been relatively isolated from society. Someone who was so taken with Lee Oswald, and he with me. We had so much in common. It's a man who has been much maligned. He's been blamed as the assassin of our President Kennedy, when in fact he was the opposite. He was trying to save the president. These things need to come out, but I didn't have any way to talk about them earlier. If I tried to speak out at that time, they would have arrested me as Lee Harvey Oswald's accomplice or girlfriend who knew what was going to happen. If I talked later about it, my little kids, what would happen? They could have been taken away from me. What would my husband have said? And finally, and there weren't any records to say things like the CIA and the mafia had been working together. Who would have believed me? Who would have believed about this dreadful polio and cancer virus that was infecting the whole population when that was a secret at that time? Who would have believed until AIDS came along that those kind of things could happen? For so many reasons, there was nothing I could do, but now I can. And I loved Lee Oswald, and I know he loved me. And I want to clear his name. I want it made perfectly clear that this was a brave man who gave his life for his country, and he's been much maligned. I want to do this out of revenge, too, because some of the people who caused the death of President Kennedy are still alive, and I hope they get caught. And that's all I want to say.
I have known Judyth's sister for about 5 years. She invited me over one evening to meet her sister, who was connecting through Dallas on her way back home to Louisiana. While we were sitting and having coffee that evening, she began to tell me the story of her affair with Lee Oswald and her connection with Roswell Medical Institute, I believe is what it's called. And I'm listening to this for about 3.5, 4 hours, maybe even 5 hours, and I'm just kind of at a loss for words of what I was being told. I'm thinking to myself, she's telling me she's involved with the Kennedy assassination in some way. Okay. After hearing her story, I was totally skeptical. Well, she told me that she was flying on an airline to go back home the following day, and I work for that airline. And so she had also told me that she had been contacted by a major national news company that was investigating her story. And I thought, well, here's my chance. I'll find out, if this is really the truth. And sure shooting, it was. Everything she told me was true. About 2 months after I had met Judyth, she had invited me and her sister to come into New Orleans, and so she could show us exactly all the places she was talking about, what she had told me about, documents I had seen. And so we went around, and one of the stops we needed to make was to the library there. She wanted to do some more investigation. We were looking for the architectural diagrams of Guy Bannister's offices. And we finally found it. We found the original of what we were looking for that showed the 2 entrances. I went personally to have it printed out. And I took it to the gentleman there at the counter, and he said, "Certainly, I'll get this for you." When we arrived back at the hotel that evening, the document that I had asked for was not the document that I had received. It was the altered copy of the same area. With the amount of detail that Judyth has on her story about herself, her connection with her cancer projects, Lee, it is just staggering. You cannot imagine the wealth of information that's coming from this woman, that the only way that she could have this kind of information is if she were there. Since knowing Judyth, many things have happened to me that have been very strange. The strangest of all is at the loss of my house. I was staying with my parents at this time due to illness in the family. And I went to check on my house, and it had been broken into and filled with feces, animal feces, in the depth of about 2 feet high throughout. I totally lost everything. Clothing, furnishings, it was totally destroyed. I've called the police on this. I've talked with the insurance adjusters. They're all totally stunned at what they've encountered when they've walked into this house. When the police officer arrived, the stench was so bad he thought there was a dead body inside. This was obviously not a petty crime. Why, with good reason, would anyone try to do this to me just to keep me from investigating more of Judyth's story?
How does this Manhattan-type crash project connect to New Orleans?
The Manhattan-type project was done in New Orleans in part to keep it out of the Bethesda, Washington, D.C. area where it might have been. It was also in New Orleans to put it close to the people that they wanted to supervise the work. And here I'm talking in particular about Dr. Ochsner. And to understand the background of this, you have to understand Ochsner's connection to the polio vaccine. And when the polio vaccine was produced, there were several laboratories, I believe the number 6, producing the vaccine. And Ochsner was one of the major stockholders of one of these laboratories. He had also been one of the people promoting the release of the polio vaccine all along. And in fact, this situation was so intense that when the Francis trials occurred up in Michigan, and it was said that the polio vaccine was safe, they, at the last minute, asked Bernice Eddy at the National Institute of Health, who was the official vaccine safety tester, to test the vaccines. And when she injected these vaccines into her monkeys, she got back dead and crippled monkeys. So she tried to delay the release of the vaccine. But the problem was that every day they waited, there was another 100 children getting polio. And there was a lot of inertia on this, all the way back from President Roosevelt's pushing forward and the marching dimes and everything else. And Ochsner was so convinced that Jonas Salk's vaccine was safe that he decided to publicly inoculate his own grandchildren with the vaccine in front of the faculty of Tulane Medical School. And the result of this bold and courageous action was that his grandson died from polio and his granddaughter got polio. That puts it in New Orleans.
Okay. Where do you want to go from here? You want to talk about the search for the particle accelerator?
No, polio, this is the thing. It's a very flawed vaccine, so they're trying to realize how deadly.
Do we need to maintain quiet, please?
Okay. Well, go ahead and tell. Okay, here we go. Ready?
Yeah.
Tell me about your experiences in researching this topic in New Orleans. What did you learn?
What got me started on this project is the fact that I had heard rumors as early as the late 1960s that there was some kind of secret operation going on in New Orleans that had something to do with cancer-causing monkey viruses. And by night, there's a siren. Let's just wait it up.
What got you started in your investigation into this topic?
Well, on one hand, I had heard rumors as early as the late 1960s that there was some kind of underground medical research going on in New Orleans that involved cancer and monkey viruses. And I was concerned about this because it sounded to me like a dangerous activity. And around 1990, the mainstream scientific community out of National Institute of Health and other places started saying that the AIDS virus, the AIDS epidemic, was caused by a mutated monkey virus. And I thought it was fair and reasonable that somebody ought to gather together what was known about these two issues and lay it on a table and examine it. Now, at that time that I started, I was not aware of the SV40 issue in particular, because SV40 is a separate monkey virus than the AIDS thing, so there's no confusion there. But it was I had also heard back in the 60s about the contamination of the polio vaccine, and I did not know if I could document it. But what I was very pleased to find was that there was very good documentation out there supporting the knowledge that the polio vaccine was contaminated with a cancer-causing virus, several of them in fact, but the most dangerous one was SV40, which the experts today now say is the most carcinogenic element or entity they have ever found.
How does Dr. Mary Sherman connect to this?
Dr. Mary Sherman was one of the nation's leading cancer experts. The fact that she was murdered under suspicious circumstances and apparently had the investigation into her murder shut down called some questions about her activities. And it is my reasonable conclusion that Mary Sherman was involved in this effort to rapidly develop an anti-cancer vaccine where they were using radiation as the means of mutation. It should be noted that Mary Sherman worked for Dr. Alton Ochsner and was the head of his cancer lab at Ochsner Clinic.
I had it, I lost it. Wait a minute. Can you tell us, describe briefly the circumstances of her death?
Well, the newspaper version of her death and the rumor mill version of her death are both wrong, completely wrong in my opinion. They found her body in her apartment and they concluded that she died in her apartment. I was able to get a hold of the autopsy protocol, the actual documents from the medical examiner's office, and it is very obvious that there's a problem with the story. And the problem goes like this. Mary Sherman did not die in her apartment. There is nothing in her apartment that could have created the damage to her body or that they found. And what that damage was that her entire right arm was burned off. All that was left was about a 6-inch carbonized stump. Now immediately next to that was unburned human hair. Now the bone is the hardest thing to burn on a body. Technically it doesn't even burn. You just dehydrate it. But the hair is the easiest. So how do you get thousands of degrees of temperature required to disintegrate a bone next to human hair? The only answer to that is very high voltage electricity. The other problem was the actual cause of death on Mary Sherman was a stab wound to the heart, which hemorrhaged. There were about 1,200 cc's of blood in the pericardium sac. There was also 6 other stab wounds on her including a wound to her liver, which did not hemorrhage. Now, the importance of this is you hemorrhage when you're alive, and you do not hemorrhage when you're dead. So those two sets of stab wounds did not occur at the same time. Now, what I'm proposing about Mary Sherman's death was that Mary Sherman was electrocuted in a very high voltage incident. And I'll talk about the motive behind the incident in a minute. But basically, she grabbed onto something, probably the switch handle to shut off the electricity and turn on the electricity. And she was standing in front of a steel wall, a special metal wall that they had put in this facility to protect the operators from the radiation. The electricity ran down her arm and out her back into the steel wall, disintegrating her arm. It did not cross her heart, and she did not die as a result of the incident. She was, however, very badly damaged and probably would not have survived. Someone stabbed her in the heart very precisely with a very slim surgical instrument to kill her. It's a mercy killing at that point. Then they put her body in a body bag. They brought it back to her apartment. They dumped it on her bed. They they opened the drawer next to her bed. They grabbed a bunch of underwear. They dropped it on her. They stabbed her at that point because there are V-cuts in the underwear from the knife. Okay? They didn't see her. I mean, people were in a hurry is what I'm trying to say. And then they started a fire. The reason they started the fire was to create an explanation, however tenuous, for the burns on her body. The fire that occurred in her apartment, which did not burn the curtains next to her bed, did not burn the paper label on the sherry bottle, did not reach the temperature required to burn the underwear fully, was not capable of burning off her arm. So there are two sets of stab wounds and two fires. The newspaper never said Mary Sherman's arm was missing. It was the main fact of the case, and it was concealed from public view. The fact that Mary Sherman died somewhere besides her apartment raises the question, where was she electrocuted?
Before we get to that, do you feel like that she was murdered and then had the murder covered up as a criminal murder, or was it an accident that then she was murdered to conceal the accident, or something else?
The motive behind the electrocution of Mary Sherman is sort of in the realm of speculation, because you cannot prove that it was not an industrial accident that somebody just wanted to cover up because of liability issues. I think due to the nature of it and what it would have taken to route that much electricity back to that one point, bypassing all the safety equipment in the linear particle accelerator, makes me conclude that it was an act of sabotage. And it was an act of sabotage done in order to expose the secret laboratory, a laboratory within 1 mile of Lee Oswald's apartment, a laboratory within 1 mile of Dr. Alton Oshner's house. I don't know that Mary Sherman was actually the target, but she was the one who got electrocuted. If Alton Oshner himself had grabbed the handle and pulled it up, it would have been very difficult to drag him back to his home and call it a sex slashing, which is what they did to Mary Sherman. The point as it relates to the JFK investigation that I would like to make is the day Mary Sherman died was the day the Warren Commission started its New Orleans chapter of the investigation. And if they had noticed that an operation involving Dr. Alton Oshner, who was the man behind Inca that organized the media coverage of Lee Harvey Oswald before the assassination, a light bulb would have gone off in their head. There would have been some obvious connection, and there is a connection. In fact, pause for a second?
Yeah, you,
Rolling.
okay, you ready to go?
Yeah. One of the most interesting and frankly disturbing points of this entire investigation is that there is some level of connection between Dr. Alton Oshner and Lee Harvey Oswald. And I say that completely confidently because right here we have a record album which was produced and released by Dr. Alton Oshner concerning the radio debates involving Lee Harvey Oswald. And on the back of this record album is a photograph of Dr. Alton Oshner where it points out that he was one of the few people in the listening audience who knew about, quote, Oswald's defection to the Soviet Union before the debate. Now I want to ask the question directly. This man was the president of the American Cancer Society. What is the president of the American Cancer Society doing getting tangled up with Lee Harvey Oswald? I think the answer involves cancer.
Okay. Explain. We're going.
Okay, sorry.
What was Oshner's connection to Inca, and explain Inca?
Okay, Inca was an anti-communist propaganda.
Can we start that again? Inca was.
Inca was an anti-communist propaganda operation founded and financed, founded by...
Okay, hold it, cut. Inca stood for?
Inca was an organization called the Information Council for the Americas. This was essentially an anti-communist propaganda operation out of New Orleans where they shipped tapes, anti-communist tapes, to radio stations all throughout Latin America. Inca was founded by Dr. Alton Oshner, who was also the president of International House and an important member of the trade community in New Orleans. And the financing for Inca came primarily from Dr. Oshner and from the community of the business community of New Orleans. One of the most important people on the list on that was the owner of WDSU Radio and the owner of WDSU Television. This is important because these are the stations, the radio stations, that hosted the Oswald debates, and they were the stations that sent out the cameras to videotape Oswald handing out his anti-Castro leaflets. So there is an involvement with Oshner, with Inca, and with Oswald going on in New Orleans in the summer of 1963, and the record album I showed you is the proof positive that it was there.
Was there any connection between Inca and the Central Intelligence Agency?
That's a little difficult to answer. I'm sorry. Okay.
How about, we know that the CIA had sponsored many anti-Castro groups, but I'm unclear as to, or something like that.
The question of whether there was a connection between the CIA and Inca as a operative organization carrying out CIA operations is a difficult question to answer. There was a similar question is, was there a connection between Dr. Alton Oshner and the CIA? One of the things about Inca that you can say when you look at the masthead of people on it was one of the directors on it, in fact the head of security for Inca, was Robert Reynold, who was the president of the former special agents of the FBI.
Pause.
For Mary Sherman's body. Okay. What was the reports on the finding of Mary Sherman's body?
Mary Sherman's body was found at about 4:30 in the morning on Tuesday, July 21st, 1964. The circumstances were that one of her neighbors smelled smoke. His name was Juan Valdez. He called the police department, not the fire department. Sorry, time out.
Had the finding of, or how did the authorities become aware of Mary Sherman's death?
very early in the morning, about 4:30 in the morning on Tuesday, July 21st, 1964, one of the neighbors living in the apartment house in Mary Sherman's apartment complex smelled some smoke. His name was Juan Valdez. He called the police department. The police arrived shortly, noticed there was smoke coming from one of the apartments whose door was ajar. They called the fire department. The fire department came. The apartment was full of smoke, but nobody reported seeing a flame. The fire department went in and removed the mattress, which was the cause of the smoke, and moved it out into the parking lot. It was then that they went in and found Mary Sherman's body laying on the floor. It had rolled off the mattress when they moved it. The body was in the opposite position with the feet pointing towards the head of the bed, and her arm was stretched out straight and her legs were stretched out straight, as if she had been lying in a still position for some time after death. It was then they realized they had a murder on their hands, and they called in the New Orleans Police Department's homicide unit.
Okay.
I want to hear the word
rigor mortis, or how we want to phrase that.
why, I want to have the explanation why it was that state.
Yeah.
Well, isn't the point that her body had been laying there for so long?
Down the whole rigor mortis issue. Okay, there are other issues about the hard drugs that people say they found in their system and all that other stuff that I don't want to get into here because it's too extraneous.
May I ask a question?
Jim asked me when I think Mary Sherman died.
Okay. Yeah, that's going to lead me into my next question. When do you think Mary Sherman died?
Well, the traditional explanation is that she died late Tuesday morning, right before the fire, because whoever killed her set the fire. But my analysis, which says she did not die in her apartment, means that she died hours before that, maybe even on the evening, Monday evening beforehand, which would explain why her body was in a stiffened position there, because that would be an indication of rigor mortis setting in, where the scenario of an intruder slashing her in some sort of act of violence would not necessarily leave her with her legs outstretched and her arm in a extended position immediately up against her body.
Apparently it took a great amount of electricity to produce the energy necessary to disintegrate her arm. Would you say that's true?
Burning a bone or disintegrating a bone, it was one of the key issues that I had to investigate. My question was, what temperature does it take to burn a bone? And in order to get an answer for that, I called a man who cremated people for a living. And I wanted to know what the temperatures of his ovens were, and I thought it was going to be a pretty simple answer. He'd give me a number and a time, and I would walk away with my number and go think about it. And he couldn't believe the question. And when I said that this person's arm had been burned off, he said, "I've seen a lot of bodies, and I can't imagine that an arm was burned off. Don't you think it might have been cut off?" And I said, well, there was no indication of that. He said that he used to work for the military, and he would go into the crash sites of military jets where the pilots had been soaked in Jet A fuel, which burns at 5,000 degrees. He said the temperature was so hot that it burned the aluminum off of the jet, but the pilot's bones were still there. So 5,000 degrees will not burn a bone, not to the point of disintegration. So whatever temperature hit Mary Sherman's arm was way up there, way above 5,000 degrees.
What would require such massive amounts of energy?
Well, the
you
type.
See where I'm going.
Yeah. I'm going there. I'm going
okay.
there. The amount of electricity that it would take to produce the damage that we saw in Mary Sherman is equivalent to the amount of electricity in a lightning bolt. There are very few machines that produce that much electricity. One of them is a linear particle accelerator, which requires about 5 million volts to produce its radioactive beam.
And what is a particle accelerator used for?
A linear particle accelerator is sort of like a poor man's atom smasher. It is a means of generating a beam of radiation without creating a nuclear explosion. And it has been used for a number of scientific purposes. Today, it is used to burn tumors. That's its application in the medical field. But it's been used for many other things, such as it can strip the impurities out of a diamond.
So in other words, if it's used for tumors, then a particle beam accelerator could be used in cancer research.
Particle beam accelerators are used in cancer research, and there are many documents of it. In fact, the American Cancer Society had a number of programs that they financed and sponsored for that, as did the National Science Foundation.
Have you found any evidence that such a particle beam accelerator was used at that time in New Orleans?
We were able to locate the man who said he built the accelerator in New Orleans. We were able to locate an engineer who worked in the buildings that we were suspicious that it might have been in, and these buildings were on the grounds of the U.S. Health Service Hospital, who described the same wiring that the man who said he built the accelerator put in to the buildings. In his words, in the words of the engineer, the superintendent, he said, "I've been doing this work for over 20 years. I have never seen electrical equipment as massive and powerful as was in the infectious disease laboratory building of the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital in New Orleans."
You need to stop.
Used in this covert cancer research Manhattan type project?
Yes, my conclusion is that this Medical Manhattan Project, which was being conducted on the grounds of the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital in New Orleans, was using a linear particle accelerator for the purpose of accelerating the mutation of cancer-causing viruses. And the danger and ethical issues involved in doing that is why they kept it so secret.
Do you have any knowledge of any other covert cancer laboratories in or around New Orleans at that time?
There was another laboratory which was discovered in New Orleans in the late 1960s. It was discovered by the investigative team working for District Attorney Jim Garrison during his investigation into the Kennedy assassination. And this was an underground medical laboratory which was reportedly using cancer-causing viruses to create cancer. And what is particularly disturbing about this laboratory is the location of the laboratory was in the hands of people who can easily be described as right-wing political extremists.
Such as?
Such as David Ferrie.
Okay, can you rephrase that so we can get into a separate statement about David Ferrie?
Or just say,
instead of such as.
The lab that the Garrison team uncovered was located in the apartment of David Ferrie. Can you say that? Or are you comfortable with that? Or mainly I just want to get a statement saying David Ferrie was in charge of that or connected to it.
Okay.
It wasn't in his apartment, right?
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, just say that.
Well, but I don't want him to say that if he doesn't know that for sure.
You ready?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
There seems to have been two laboratories at work in New Orleans on this cancer-causing monkey virus issue. One is what I'll call the big lab. That was the lab at the U.S. Public Health Service Hospital. The little lab was located on Louisiana Avenue Parkway in the apartment of a man named David Ferry. David Ferry is widely described by many people as a right-wing political extremist.
Pause.
Great, Roland.
Mm-hmm.
What was the connection between David Ferry and Dr. Mary Sherman?
A number of JFK researchers have made statements about the connection between Dr. Mary Sherman and David Ferry, including Gerald Posner and John Davis. The connection between them was not very visible and was in the realm of
Well, just collect your thoughts.
I just want to make a point that they agree with this
I love it.
thing, yeah.
Yeah.
John Davis in the Warren Commission apologies?
No.
Mafia
Kingfish.
Kingfish.
Is, though. That's why he wants to put the two together. They both agree that there's a connection.
That's what I'm saying. Everybody's pronouncing it Posner.
Well, he pronounces it Posner.
He himself?
Uh-huh.
Hmm.
Okay. What was the connection between Mary Sherman and David Ferry?
The connection between Mary Sherman and David Ferry is a little bit hard for me to document, but there are JFK researchers such as Gerald Posner and John Davis who claim that they were good friends. I have also talked to some witnesses who say the same thing. I will emphasize that this relationship was not very visible to the outside community. If you had asked Mary Sherman's friends, they wouldn't have known about it. But there seems to be, particularly from some testimony I've heard, a very strong relationship, and a relationship which was based on this cancer research project.
Based on your knowledge and research, can you describe what Ferry's apartment contained and what it looked like when he died under somewhat strange circumstances?
The description of David Ferry's apartment from people who were in it talk about the presence of mice, the presence of medical books and medical equipment, and the smell of mice in that. Jim Garrison describes that in his books. Bob Turner, who was also in the apartment, told me personally that that was what he saw when he was in there. I will emphasize that I was in an apartment very close to David Ferry's apartment that also contained a residual smell of animals. And I write about this in my book. And my conclusions to that, for reasons I explain in the book, is that this second apartment was part of the cancer operation, and they were testing the results of their cancer virus experiments on animals in this second apartment. And both of these apartments were taken off of the market for about 5 years and renovated and put back on the market at the same time. So we're talking about 2 rental apartments within 100 yards of each other, both taken off of the market for 5 years and renovated. And one of those apartments was definitely David Ferry's apartment.
Okay. Go ahead and cut and let's.
Very difficult to put them together. You know, the thing that I was always hoping for when I was writing the book, because I had no confidence that we were going to find a piece of paper that put them together, but we might find a person that put them together. And when you read my book, the last chapter of my book is about this teacher that I had when I was 13, 14 years old. She had 3 sons. They were all judges in Louisiana. And she told us before the Warren Commission had announced the results, she said they are going to blame it on Oswald. They're going to say he acted alone, and the reason is they don't want to get into who he was working for.
So this is the reason why the Kennedys still are not talking and going along
Yeah,
with Warren.
that's right. That's right.
It's not fear. It's just embarrassment, or what is it? Publicity.
Well, I mean, how would they explain to the American public
Smart,
that,
you know.
that Lee was working for Bobby? I mean, you know.
And it even goes beyond that. He's working with fit in.
Does Hoover know?
What's Hoover doing with Bannister? Now, Bannister, yeah, as you know, was the head of the Chicago office for a while. Okay.
Down New Orleans running Oswald.
Right, and the telephone traffic says that he was talking to J. Edgar Hoover on a regular basis. Okay? Now, I think a lot of the analysis that has been done on Lee in New Orleans is upside down. It is exactly wrong. I mean, it's like my physics teacher used to say, I can always tell when somebody's about to get the idea because they get it backwards. Okay? What was going on wrong in New Orleans was a violation of the Neutrality Act. Okay? The mob was training people to assassinate Fidel Castro. Right?
That's a fact.
Okay, and if you're the Attorney General of the United States, and particularly if you're in the situation that they were in at that time, you want to bust that operation. Somebody's got to infiltrate that thing close enough to identify the location of the training camp so that they can bust it. And in my opinion, that was Lee's major contribution in New Orleans, was he identified the location of the training camp that was trying to kill Fidel Castro. The fact that he also managed to infiltrate the laboratory which was developing the biological weapon designed to kill Castro, I think is the second accomplishment in there.
Make it look too much like it. Better? Okay?
Okay, we're rolling 35 minutes. About Judyth.
When did you first hear the name Judyth Very Baker?
In the fall of 1972, excuse me.
Okay.
Don't stop it. Don't stop it. The first time I ever heard the name Judyth Very Baker was in the fall of 1972. I had been invited to a party hosted by a woman who is apparently associated with the graduate school of Tulane University. It is interesting to point out that the reason I was invited to this party had something to do with an argument I had the prior week at Tulane University with someone concerning David Ferry's laboratory. This party was held on Pitt Street, right behind the Latter Library, and my girlfriend told me that we were going to the residence of Judyth Very Baker. I remember the name particularly because being trained by the Jesuits, they teach you to take apart words, and I wondered if this was very, V-E-R-I, meaning true, or V-A-R-I, meaning changing. But I definitely remember the name Judyth Very Baker. We went into the party, which was upstairs, and I spent most of the evening talking to her husband, but I did talk to her several times during the evening, where she told me that she was from Florida and that she was working at Tulane Medical School on a project involving esoteric experiments with exotic chemicals, and that she had recently been in northern Florida doing some kind of chemical research. Later that evening, my girlfriend came in a very excited manner and told me that they said that Judyth knew Oswald. And I said, wait a minute, who is they? Are we talking the Warren Commission or what here? And she said, no, Judyth said she knew Oswald. And just then, this Judyth woman, who's not the Judyth Very Baker we know, but the Judyth Very Baker I met that night, came into the kitchen and walked over to me and said, Ed, I understand you're interested in the Garrison investigation. Is this something you'd like to talk about? And I looked her straight in the eye and I laughed at her and I said, no, it's not. Because all my warning lights were on at this point. I didn't know who this person was or why I had been selected to be there, but I knew that I didn't want to get into a conversation that night with someone who said that they were a friend of Lee Harvey Oswald's. And that was the first time I ran into it.
And then
The next time I heard the name Judyth Vary Baker was in the fall of the year 2000, when I was contacted by a national news organization. And they sent me some information about her. And they didn't tell me who she was, it just, as I laid on the sofa and started reading it, I ran across the name. And I immediately recognized it. And I had her phone number as part of the material, and so I just picked up the telephone and called her to say, hey, I remember you, I had dinner at your house. And it turned out it wasn't the real her. The first one wasn't the real her. The real Judyth Vary Baker is the one that was brought to me by the National News Organization. Now, what's left is a bunch of questions about who set up that initial meeting between me and the fake Judyth Vary Baker, because I seem to know a lot about David Ferry's underground medical laboratory.
Is there any doubt in your mind that the people, or that the woman passing herself off as Judyth Vary Baker in 1972 had patterned herself on the real Judyth Vary Baker, which means that someone knew the true Baker and her circumstances?
The first Judyth Vary Baker that I met had a profile background that was almost identical to the real Judyth Vary Baker. The details of the type of research that she was involved in, where she was from in Florida, where she had worked recently in northern Florida, is all almost identical. I find it impossible to believe that this is a coincidence of any nature. I am, comfortable and confident with my own conclusion that whoever set up that first meeting in the fall of 1972 knew who Judyth Vary Baker was, knew about her connection to David Ferry, and knew about her connection to Lee Harvey Oswald.
Do you feel like that this party that you were invited to, do you think this was, this impersonation, do you think this impersonation was aimed specifically at you, or do you think that she might have been trying to draw in information from anybody that she could who came into her orbit?
I am at a loss to even guess the motives behind this thing or who was behind it. I could maybe guess, but I would be speculating. I do not know who organized the thing, but I do know that they had to have a very high level of knowledge of the covert operations going on in New Orleans in the early 1960s in order to put it together.
Okay. How did it come about that you attended this party back in 1972?
Well, first of all, there was an incident that I write about in my book where my girlfriend had heard that Dr. Alton Ochsner was part of some international right-wing organization connected to South America. In fact, she used the term Nazi and fascist in her description. I pointed out to her that many of Ochsner's backers were Jewish, and I thought the description of him as a Nazi was probably not a good way to describe it. However, being in New Orleans, I had heard many rumors that he was extremely right-wing and he held a lot of very controversial theories about things. But everybody in New Orleans knew the name Ochsner. A couple of days later, I went to meet my girl. It's an ice maker. 1, 2, 3. A couple of days later, I went to meet my girlfriend on the steps of the Social Science Building. There she introduced me to the person who had made the comments to her about Dr. Ochsner. We all agreed to go have coffee over in the University Center and talk about these secret matters. Being young males, we were trying to outdo each other with what great secret stuff we knew.
Can you redo that? Being young males?
Being young males, we were trying to outdo each other with all the great secret stuff we know. And I got into talking about David Ferry's medical laboratory that Jim Garrison had discovered during the Garrison investigation in the late 1960s. This led to a larger conversation of cancer-causing viruses, where I was informed that viruses could not cause cancer, and I was misinformed and rather stupid. And our discussion developed into what one might describe as an argument and stopped short of being a fight. A couple of days later, my girlfriend came to me, and she was a graduate student in anthropology, and she said, "Ed, I need to talk to you." She said, "You know, you're a nice guy and I like you, but I can't afford to have a boyfriend that's going to intimidate and alienate my graduate school colleagues." Okay, so you got a decision to make whether you want to be an expert on David Ferry and the Jim Garrison investigation or whether you want to be my boyfriend. Okay, so if you think you can control yourself, I'll give you a second try. Okay, and I assured her that I was willing to try to control myself, and I would not discuss Jim Garrison or David Ferry's laboratory or the Kennedy assassination or any of that stuff in front of her graduate school colleagues. Several days later, she came back and said, "Well, it wasn't all bad." And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, your performance the other day in the University Center attracted some attention, and we've been invited to a party. And you should understand that this party is being organized by women in Tulane's graduate school, and we're allowed to invite our significant other, but the men have to understand to keep their mouths shut because it's the women's party." So I'm on probation from my girlfriend. I've promised not to discuss the Kennedy assassination or David Ferry or any of that stuff, and I'm going to this party. So Friday night, we get in my blue Maverick, we're driving down St. Charles Avenue, and I said, "So where are we going?" She said, "Well, Pitt Street. Here, I got the address. You turn on Dufochet." I hadn't heard of Dufochet Street, but it's right there on St. Charles Avenue, and we finally found the sign, and I turned right. She said the instructions are to go 2 blocks and park. So I go 2 blocks and I park, and New Orleans has a lot of ditches and bumpy roads, and my car is parked over on the right. And I said to her, I said, "Well, I would like to know whose house we're going to, just so I can thank the hostess. I mean, it's the polite thing to do." And she said, "Well, her name is Judyth Very Baker." I said, "Oh, she gets 3 names, huh? Are you going to introduce me as Edward Thomas Haslam?" You know? To which she responded with this Gloria Steinem speech about why women in academia need 3 names. It was basically a feminist diatribe. But when she was finished, I said, "So her name's Judy Baker, huh?" And she said, "No, this woman is definitely Judyth." Just at that time, we saw some of her graduate student friends walking up to the front of the building where we could follow them into the party. We went up the stairs into the party. The stairs entered in the kitchen, and I was introduced to this woman, Judyth, who I can assure you is not the same Judyth Very Baker we have today. But she was thin and very disciplined in her presentation. I remember she had sort of a lumpy or a bumpy nose, kind of like I do, and a little bit of an Adam's apple. She had kind of freckles on her, and her husband was kind of a crew-cut guy who had studied some kind of engineering thing, and they had a small baby. And so the women went out on the screen porch to talk, and I sat around with the husband and watched the baby. And I remember at one point there was a little brass screw that had fallen between the wood, and I was concerned about the baby getting to it, so I went and got a knife and pulled it out. At any rate, we could hear the noise on the screen porch increasing as the women drank more wine and talked more. And at one point I went back into the kitchen to get some more food, and that is when I ran into this Judyth woman to talk to her one-on-one. I was suspicious about this party because it was the result of my conversations about David Ferry in the first place, so I'll say warning light 1 was already on. When we started talking and she said she was connected with the Tulane Medical School, it was very clear that she did not recognize my father's name. And my father was a professor there for 20 years. And it was a very common experience for me to go around New Orleans and have people say, "Oh, you're Ed Haslam. You must be Ed Haslam's son." And so people recognized my father's connection to the medical school all the time. This woman did not recognize it at all. That was warning light number 2. So I asked her to talk about what she did. And she says, "Oh, I never talk about my work. I do esoteric experiments with exotic chemicals." And my sister was married to an MIT professor, and I was used to talking to people about all kind of interesting things, so I decided to try to get her to talk about it. And I tried, and I tried, and I tried, and she would not talk about the details of what she did. Now, many people in New Orleans were very aware that the CIA was doing a lot of research down at Tulane Medical School, particularly on the psychoactive drugs. So it occurred to me that she might have been connected with that operation and was not supposed to talk about it. So I backed off at that point in time. Then I went back to talk to her husband, and she went back out on the porch. About an hour later, I came back into the kitchen, and that's when my girlfriend, Barbara, showed up in a very excited, agitated mode and said, "Ed, they say Judyth knew Oswald." And I'm thinking to myself, this is great. I'm on probation. I'm not supposed to talk about the JFK assassination or Oswald or Ferry or any of those things. And I'm at a party with a bunch of half-drunk feminists who are now saying that the hostess of the party was Lee Harvey Oswald's good buddy. So what do I do? And just then, this Judyth woman comes in the room, and she locks in on me and comes across the room and in a very funny way says, "I hear that you're interested in the Garrison investigation. Is that something you'd like to talk about?" And I looked her straight in the eye and I laughed and I said, "As a matter of fact, no, it's not." And I turned on my heel and I walked into the next room because Barbara had left the room, and I said, "You asked me not to talk about this subject, okay? How do I stay at this party and not talk about this subject? Can we leave?" And she said, "Well, that's a fair assessment. Yeah, we can leave." And we left the party at that point in time. About 2 weeks later, Barbara said to me, "You remember that Judyth gal?" I said, "Yes." I said, "What was her last name?" She said, "Baker." I said, "Yeah, I remember her." She said, "We've got an invitation to go to dinner at her house. Would you like to go?" I said, "Is this the same woman who said that she was Lee Harvey Oswald's friend?" And she said, "Yes, I forgot about that part." And I said, "Well, I haven't, and I don't want to go to dinner at her house." And that was the last contact I had with them at that point. And again, I emphasize, the whole story is as mysterious to me as it is to anybody else who hears it. And I don't know who was behind it, but I do know what I experienced, and I do know when it happened, and I remember the names very clearly.
Okay. Now tell me about...
The next time I heard the name Judyth Vary Baker was in the fall of the year 2000. And I had been contacted by some people associated with a national news program that was investigating this woman that was described to me as a girlfriend of Lee Harvey Oswald's. They did not tell me her name at that point. But they told me that she said that she was in the laboratory that I wrote about my book, in David Ferry's laboratory. And did I want to talk to this person who said that she was in David Ferry's laboratory? Well, frankly, it was not a good time to ask me that question because I was doing other things in my life, and no, I didn't. But they were persistent, and they finally got me to agree to look at some documents. And they FedExed me a package of documents that laid on my floor for about a week, but I finally got around to reading them. And when I started to read them, and I ran across the name Judyth Vary Baker, I knew I recognized it. And I remembered it from that incident. And her phone number was included in the materials they sent me. So I picked up the telephone thinking it was the same woman. And it's going to be a piece of cake. I just picked her up and called and introduced myself and said, "Do you remember me? I had dinner at your house in 1972. And I was very surprised to hear her say, "I didn't live in New Orleans in 1972. I left in the 1960s and never went back as a permanent resident." And at that point in time, my buzzers went off, because I knew for sure that I now knew two different people who told me their names were Judyth Very Baker, and one of them had to be a fraud.
Tell me your assessment of the current Judyth Very Baker and her story and accounts of these cancer labs and working in the labs, and does it fit with your knowledge?
Judyth Very Baker, or
Can
what
you start that one again? My take on.
Okay. My take on the current Judyth Very Baker, or the real Judyth Very Baker, is that, first of all, she is the real Judyth Very Baker. And I say this for a couple of reasons. One is I have researched an entire collection of newspaper articles which were written about her back when she was still a high school student and somewhat of a superstar, because they were all expecting her to go out and find a cure for cancer. And I know that these documents are real. I've looked at the microfilm from the publication that they were published in, and there's no doubt in my mind that this woman is the same person I saw in the photographs and the articles were about. It is interesting to note that she was trained at a very early age for a very high level of laboratory work in terms of handling cancer-causing viruses. The second point is her claim concerning knowing Lee Harvey Oswald. She has a number of original documents in her possession which show that she worked at the same company that Lee Oswald worked at, which was the Riley Coffee Company, that she started on the same day he started on, that she left the company on the same day that he started on. And I think that is a pretty good collection of documents to support her claim that she knew Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans in the summer of 1963. There are some collateral documents in there, such as her bank statements and stuff. She just happened to use the same bank I use. So I noticed the deposit statements and all that looked authentic to me in terms of I had seen the same types of deposit statements back then. And beyond that, her next sort of circle going out in her story is her descriptions of what was going on in this little laboratory on Louisiana Avenue Parkway. And I will say that her descriptions of that and of the players involved are very consistent with my knowledge and understanding of what was going on over there. What I decided to do about this was to sit back and watch, because I wanted to see if this woman changed her story. And all I did was I stayed in contact, and it's been a couple of years now that I've been in contact with her. And I have found her to be remarkably tenacious in sticking to what her original story and claims were. I've seen her cry at all the right times and laugh at all the right times. And so my method of judging her has not been to query her on which finger did Lee Oswald wear his wedding ring on. I mean, I think that's a ridiculous approach to it. I tried to look at her as a person and see if she made sense to me as a person. And I'll say she's an unusual person. She's very bright. She's very giddy at times and stuff, but she is a very real person to me, and I think she's the genuine article.
In your research, did you come similar to Judyth Very Baker, working in and around those labs, but maybe you didn't get it, were unable to locate her?